I think that everybody is a little bit tired now, but I can assure you that this panel will be very exciting with very interesting papers. Our topic here is small states and non-traditional actors in the developing geopolitical environment. Instead of Dr. Rosler, I am going to partake the role of the mediator. I am Mate, so as you know, but I'm telling this to our virtual participants as well. We are going to have 4 papers, 4 presentations. All will have to meet the 10 minutes deadline and respect it. I have to be rigid in this regard. Let's start with the paper of Petros, Petrikkos and Marinos, Papaioakeim. Petros is a PhD candidate in International Relations and European Studies at the University of Nicosia and a Common Security and Defense Policy Doctoral Fellow at the European Security and Defense College, Research Associate at the Diplomatic Academy at the University of Nicosia, whereas Marinos is also a PhD candidate, but at the diplomacy, so he's a PhD candidate in Diplomacy and International Relations at the Department of Social and Political Science of the University of Cyprus. Their paper is titled Small States Under Threat in Non-Traditional Security Setting, Power Projection Through International Organizations. Petros, Marinos, are you here?
Here.
Great. The virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rosler, for this wonderful introduction. I'm just going to take a few seconds to set up our presentation. Perfect, now you should be able to see our presentation.
Yes.
As we have already mentioned, we are examining the concept of under threat, small states under threat in non-traditional security settings, and the power projection that they have through international organizations. Just to go through the very core themes, key terms and concepts that we have, we first examine how differently do small states that are already experiencing conflict and that are under threat raise their case and promote their interests through international organizations and institutions. So we assume that there is a difference here, that it is to be emphasized, and we will be walking through our key terms and concepts. Then we move on to the concept of small states under threat and getting a bit more detailed there. Then we will be looking at the 4 main ways we have identified in our research that small states are under threat and how this is different as compared to other small states. And finally, we will be looking at different case studies as examples. And all of this research at this point is indicative and at the preliminary stage, but we have been collecting some data that we will be sharing with you shortly. So when it comes to the key terms and concepts, we are looking at the non-traditional security challenges. And we identify this as the unconventional types of challenges that transcend beyond the conventional military threats. They also impact the image that small states have, the principle of human security, cooperation, other socioeconomic issues, well-being of states and societies. And this falls in line with well-known practices that the Copenhagen and the Welsh securitization schools have. We are indeed looking at core issues, as we've said, in terms of national security and survival, but we want to emphasize the importance of individuals within small states and how small states in turn utilize their image at the international scene through international organizations. We're also looking at overarching threats in some cases, and we identify overarching threats as foreign states attempting to dominate militarily, politically, and culturally other small states, which brings us to the question of smallness, which, as we all know, and this is obviously evident in this workshop, smallness itself is an essentially contested concept, and it does suffer from different definitional issues, but we will not be getting too much into that concept. We want to focus on our mixed approach when we address smallness, which is done through identifying quantifiable variables, which is more in line with traditional approaches on population, surface size, the gross domestic product, and military capability. And on the other hand, qualitative criteria, including the amount of influence that is exercised or the way that small states are actually perceived externally, but also locally within their own population and itself, so how small states themselves identify and how this impacts their actions, tactics, and so on. And for this we also assume that participating in international organizations and institutions, certain small states, and the states specifically that we examine under threat, their core strategy is to participate in order to boost and complement their defense and security strategies. I will now pass on to Marinos to tell you a bit more about our concept on under threat.
Good afternoon also by my side. Thank you very much for the well-organized conference. And moving to our presentation. So what we're doing in our research, we're examining small states under threat. We all know that, small states, there is a vast literature about small states' participation in international organization. Even from 60s, we can identify a lot of researchers that they are talking about small states' participation in international institution and organization. So what we're doing here is that we include another variable, another aspect, and that aspect is that of existential threat, the conflict, and the issue of under threat. So we know that a lot of small states can experience both internal and external threats, including wider existential threats and conflict. As I was saying, we assume that all small states, either those threats, either without a threat, they join international organizations for various benefits. As I was saying, this is a very common practice, a well-established practice, both in academia and within the practitioners. So what we are arguing here is that the states and the benefits for those small states that are under threat are bigger and of course are different. So joining in such organization can be imperative for their survival, and they can boost their image, and also they can see how they are understood and how they can see internationally, and of course I will add domestically. To the next slide, Petros, please. So again, this is an ongoing research. What we're trying to do is to identify particular patterns of behavior of small states under threat. At least now we identify 4, but I'm sure that during our research we will identify more. Just a very brief parenthesis. We are not doing a direct comparison between small states under threat and states with no threats. This is just a physical path during our research, the indirect comparison. Now, as of the characteristics of small states under threat during their participation in international organization, we identified that they have a very particular agenda setting. Of course, the issue of existential threat, the issue of conflict is something that it's a priority for them. So they focus all their resources, human, material resources, or the media, and all of them are linked with the existential threat. So in their agenda, in this international organization, they link everything with the existential threat. Now, in terms of the diplomatic practice, what we see here is, we call it a paradox. On the one hand, we have an international emphasis of small states under threat, of how they are constantly under threat. So they are repeating again and again that we are under threat. On the other hand, they are arguing that they are experts or they are developing niche area of expertise that might be useful to a member state of the same international organization. For example, we have the Republic of Cyprus trying to demonstrate its usefulness as a mediator between the EU and the Middle East. The paradox here is that on the one hand, we have a small state request protection, security, as they are under threat. On the other hand, we can see that they're claiming that they are a hub of collaboration, a pillar of stability, etc. Moving to the next slide, very quickly. Another pattern of behavior common between small states under threat is that they attempt to join a lot of security organizations. So they have a lot of motivations since they gain a lot of benefits both at the political level and at the military level. I don't want to spend more time on this. And moving to the fourth point is that small states under threat are using their participation in international organizations due to domestic pressure and due to build their domestic image. As you all know, in societies with existential threat, we have high levels of securitization, so we have a lot of insecurity syndromes. What we see is that through their participation in international institutions and organizations, they try to calm down the insecurity syndromes that they exist in their local societies, despite the realities in the ground. I think now we can move to the several examples that they are basically support our theoretical arguments.
We just wanted to emphasize as well that these are indicative examples, and as I've mentioned at the very beginning, we're still at the preliminary stages. What we are able to present here at this point is the issues that we struggle at a systemic level. We will not be touching that much on what's happening domestically, but we are definitely keen on answering any questions you might have when it comes to how the population or societies themselves perceive these issues in such states. So some of the cases that we have here is the relationship that Cyprus within the European Union has. So on the one hand, it presents, as we've already mentioned, as a successful and capable mediator between the EU and the Middle East. It has a perception of an overarching existential threat that is the Republic of Turkey. And internationally, it tries to maintain a good image while being a reliable partner, which has been a bit problematic when it comes to recent corruption and financial scandals at EU level, which jeopardizes Cyprus's position and image within the bloc. And this also comes into question when it comes to security and creating insecurity at the state level as to whether Cyprus is still, the Republic of Cyprus, whether it is still a reliable partner as such. Then we look at other cases such as Estonia and NATO, which Estonia, as a small state, it presents itself as a pioneer in e-governance and cybersecurity practices through state-led initiatives such as e-Estonia, which is a platform that creates this nice image of Estonia abroad that is capable of fostering proper e-governance. It hosts the NATO Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence, and it also has its own perceived overarching existential threat, which according to Estonians, this is understood to be Russia. But the paradox here is that Estonia also maintains a Russian-speaking population. So this is very interesting as to the impact it has on the perceptions within society, within small societies as well. Other cases, we look at the Baltic states more broadly in terms of joining different organizations such as NATO. We have the politics of survival, which places the security guarantees at the highest potential benefit that they can draw out of such organizations. And this has also been a primary foreign policy goal post-millennium for the Baltics. We also look at Georgia and NATO, which
Sorry to interrupt. We are 12 minutes in. Can I ask you to come to a conclusion?
Of course. So to conclude, we do present all these different cases. We're happy to engage more in the conversation later on. We want to reaffirm that our understanding is that it's different for small states. They join differently for different reasons in these international institutions and organizations. They maintain other concerns as compared to other states. We are making an indirect comparison here, not a direct comparison with other small states. And we are happy to touch more on this during the discussion and questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the presentation. You know, I don't want to force my research interest on your very interesting research, but I think that also Kuwait can be a very nice case study, not necessarily in connection with the GCC, but in connection with the League of Arab States in the 1960s. Thank you very much. We are going to discuss this issue more in the Q&A session. Now let's continue the second presentation, which is entitled Country Branding and Diasporas as Tools of Power for Small Countries in the International Arena, and it will be delivered by Mare Ushkovska, who is a Global Fellow at the Council for European Studies and an Assistant Professor at International Balkan University. Dr. Ushkovska, are you here? Please unmute yourself.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Diplomacy has evolved in recent decades to accept that public opinion has a growing influence in the international relations, and democratic development of Western societies meant that there's been an increase in the number of pressure groups as well as citizen participation as a whole. The role of these groups, especially in smaller countries, which may not have sufficient funding for broad public diplomacy networks, would be constructive and could supplement governmental work on promoting a country's image, national interest, or strategic goals in foreign policy. I would be looking at certain cases where two aspects that are related to public diplomacy are used in the case of smaller countries. That would be number one, national branding, and number two, diasporas as pressure groups. Both of these aspects are promoted by non-traditional, non-governmental actors, which can work alongside states in global power dynamics. What is country branding? The application of corporate marketing concepts and techniques to countries in the interest of enhancing a country's reputation in international relations. Country branding can actually enhance the politics of a state both internally and externally. Internally, it can boost confidence in a nation and societal sense of community. In the relations with other countries, the difference between a successful, concise, and powerful, recognizable brand and that of a weaker, undefined brand can have a significant influence in the attractiveness a country has for investments and tourism. The word brand in itself means a collection of perceptions that create preferences and among people, and it is because of that that country branding, similar to branding of products, is a game that needs to be properly managed. Now, even though public diplomacy and country branding go hand in hand, they actually can be rather different in terms of who plays an important role. With public diplomacy, it is usually a coordinated approach from politicians and diplomats, whereas with country branding, it is primarily the private sector in cooperation with the public sector, but also media, television, athletes, and individual citizen groups who can all play a role in promoting a country's brand. I will go with a few cases, and I will mention first the successful example of Spain after the end of Francisco Franco's rule as an example of public-private partnership in country branding. Until 1975, Spain didn't have a significant trade or cultural influence and was seen as a country of cheap holidays and cheap wine. However, after Franco's death, there was a joint effort by cities to modernize themselves. Movie makers like Almodovar presented Spain in a very attractive manner, and Spain quickly has become one of the most desirable tourist cultural destinations. Another way in which countries, especially small countries, can rebrand themselves is through they're focused on promoting science or promoting the environment. And in this situation, we have post-communist countries trying to rebrand themselves, such as Slovenia or Estonia. Slovenia with their logo of I Feel Slovenia, where they capitalize the word love within Slovenia, or working hard to make Ljubljana the green capital of Europe. And as my colleagues previously mentioned, Estonia is an interesting example with their focus on cybersecurity and advancements in e-government, where they have branded themselves as e-Estonia, something that they want to be recognizable for, an image of technology advancement. And last but not least, there is the aspect of film and TV in country branding, and this is where I will focus most of my attention, because film and TV have been extremely influential in transforming the images of small countries. Especially in the last 2 decades, we have 2 stark examples. The first is that of New Zealand, a country which has benefited greatly from the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And even now, 2 decades after the first film was released, nearly 1 in 5 visitors of New Zealand claim that they are visiting because of the Lord of the Rings. Tourist numbers have gone up 40% in only 5 years after the first film, and huge numbers have been visiting New Zealand since. But it isn't only the touristic aspect, it's the fact that this film has been described as the best unpaid advertisement for New Zealand. It is not true, however, that there hasn't been any investment done by the state in this project, because New Zealand, in looking at the benefits that this type of advertisement brings it, has been subsidizing a lot of Hollywood-made films filmed on the territory of New Zealand. And they know that the association of these films are beneficial for the image of the country. So they try to capitalize on it by playing along with the myth of the stories to promote their country. So they use the myth of the Lord of the Rings to promote the country and attract tourists. At the same time, you have the postal service in New Zealand issuing stamps with faces of characters from the trilogy. They've also issued commemorative coins. The Air New Zealand airline has also decorated 2 airplanes in Tolkienesque themes. So this is a joint effort by the state, but also private enterprises. The second example for which this has worked recently is Croatia. Already a well-known tourist destination in the region, it was not so well-known in the North American market. However, after the Game of Thrones series, the city of Dubrovnik, where the series was filmed, has gained huge popularity with an annual growth of 50% due to the series alone. We look at the numbers of visitors. It's been about 660,000 annually in 2012. It has shot up to 1,500,000, almost million in 2019, the last year prior to the pandemic. Now moving to the diasporas as pressure groups, as another method with which small countries could gain some sense of power in the international arena. I would, of course, be remiss to not mention the most influential and most well-known diaspora in the United States, that is the Israeli diaspora. However, I would not be dwelling on it for too long, because it could also be disputed whether Israel should be considered a small state given its military power. So I would instead focus on the role of the Armenian diaspora in the United States. Diasporas in general could play diplomatic functions by facilitating the spread of a nation's culture around the world, and it could contribute to a country's soft power. So they are a non-governmental actor, which is both a cultural and a public diplomacy representative. In the case of the Armenian diaspora, this is an interesting case for two particular reasons. First, this diaspora is both remarkably numerous and vocal, given the small size of the territory and economy of Armenia. Second, in recent years, there have been several circumstances for this diaspora's activism in assisting Armenian foreign policy objectives, with campaigns for both the recognition of the Armenian genocide and for fostering support for Armenia in the 2020 conflict with Azerbaijan. On the question of recognition of the Armenian genocide, the US has been a place of significant importance for the Armenian diaspora, which is the second largest Armenian diaspora after that in Russia. And most of the American Armenians are based in the state of California. It has not been a simple task to convince the US government to recognize the Armenian genocide, because by doing so, the US would find itself in defiance of the foreign policy stance of Turkey, which is a NATO ally and a key partner in the Eastern Mediterranean. Therefore, successive US presidents have refused to issue any statements which may be interpreted as recognition of the genocide having taken place. In 2007, due to the lobbying efforts of the Armenian American constituency in California, several Californian members of the House of Representatives supported and pushed through a resolution to recognize the Armenian genocide in the US House Committee on Foreign Affairs. It was a step forward, however, lawmakers quickly abandoned the idea. Ardent opposition by the Republic of Turkey meant that administration of President Bush, just like his predecessor Clinton, would not support any steps that threaten relations with their NATO allies, especially in the context of the ongoing Iraqi war, where Turkey was a strategic partner and indispensable to the US war effort. A few months later, in 2008, when President Obama was still campaigning to become president, he said that he stood with the Armenian American community in calling for Turkey's acknowledgement of the Armenian genocide. Nevertheless, when he became president, he also renegated on keeping the campaign promise and instead used outer vocabulary. It wasn't until 2019, so quite recently, that the efforts of the Armenian diaspora came to fruition. In October 2019, the House of Representatives voted to recognize the Armenian genocide, and a few months later, the Senate also passed a similar resolution with unanimous consent. At the time, President Donald Trump rejected the resolution. Nevertheless, President Joe Biden became the first US president to officially recognize the killings of Armenians during World War I as a genocide. And most recently, last year we had, yes, I'll just conclude with this, we had the confrontation between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Armenians and Azerbaijan in the Nagorno-Karabakh region. But this was not a conflict that only occurred in the battlefield, but also in media and politics. And the Armenian diaspora was quite vocal in social media and on traditional media, gaining the attention of the world to the conflict. They've been able to influence several celebrities to express their support for Armenia, and some of the achievements they've done was to get certain communities to recognize Artsak's independence. For example, Australia's New South Wales Legislative Assembly, Italy's city of Milan, and some towns in France. And recently also the French Senate voted in favor of a resolution to adopt, to call for recognition of the Republic of Artsakh by France. Thank you so much. I look forward to discussing more in the question session.
Thank you, Professor Ushkovska. It is a very timely topic indeed. So let's continue with a live presentation. I would like to invite Flávio and Diego Hernández Nilson to the podium. Flávio is a professor of international relations at the Federal University of the Pampas and a postdoc fellow at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam. And Diego is a professor of international relations with the Department of Social Sciences at the University of the Republic of Uruguay. And their presentation is entitled Explaining Uruguay's geopolitics and international relations under the shelter theory approach. I'm really looking forward to this presentation.
So thank you everybody for the great event we've been having so far. So we're going to have this presentation called Explaining Uruguay Geopolitics and International Relations under the shelter theory approach. It's a 10-minute presentation, so it's quite quick, and we are looking forward to the Q&A session as well. So some goals of this presentation. First off, we want to present very quickly Uruguay's profile as a country, followed by the history of Uruguay in the regional integration processes, the shelter theory itself, and then the shelter theory approach as applied to Uruguay. So a map, of course, everybody knows, I hope, that Uruguay is located in South America, but it's very important that we just locate Uruguay between those two big countries in South America, Brazil and Argentina. And there you can see how much Uruguay is surrounded by both this huge body of water, the Atlantic Ocean, and also those two countries. Here's some basic data on Uruguay. Of course, we're not going to go over them, but something that is important to mention is the population of Uruguay, a little over 3 million. Religion, which is also very uncommon when we're talking about Latin American countries, so it's a highly irreligious country if you think about it. So they have 57% of the population being Christians, and 41% have no religion. It got its independence from Brazil, the Empire of Brazil, in 1825, recognized in 1828 with the Treaty of Montevideo. Very quickly, here you can see, according to the Observatory of Economic Complexity, Uruguay's exports. So it's mostly based on meat, on wood pulp, and on other agricultural products. And to support the partners, it's important for us to focus on these big four that are Uruguay's partners and have been Uruguay's partners for a long time, except for maybe for China that started more recently. So we have China, Brazil, the United States, and Argentina as the largest partners. But you can see that China is way ahead of those other partners when having these importing relations with Uruguay. And we're talking about imports, what Uruguay imports. So basically crude petroleum, some machinery, medication, etc. We are not focusing on this, of course, but I do want us to focus on the partners as well. So we have Brazil again, Argentina, and China. In this case, Brazil is the country that sells most to Uruguay. So one thing that we could talk about here very quickly is maybe consider Uruguay as the center of South American integration movements. So what happens in South America when we're talking about movements of integration that have been taking place since the Cold War, we can see there were common roots of Hispanic American countries. So basically during independence movements in the 19th century, there was a large project in Latin America, and especially in South America, to have some sort of union of those post-colonial spaces, but it did not work out, mostly because of British intervention in the 19th century. So some projects for large Latin American, South American integration did not come to fruition because of external intervention. And in the 1950s, already when the Cold War was about to take its full speed in the region, some new integration movements took place. So basically we have these two important institutions that were formed in this period, in the Cold War period, the Latin American Free Trade Association in the 60s, and Latin American Integration Association. When we have the end of the Cold War, though, there is what we call this open regionalism. So we have new blocs starting to come up in the region in a moment where neoliberalism is developing in South America. So Mercosur is one of the most famous blocs there that comprises 4 founding members, Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay, in 1991 with the Treaty of Asunción. And they are a response to the bloc formations that were taking place in Europe and North America. So not to be left behind. In South America, there was this push towards regionalism that at the same time was market-oriented. In the late 90s, there was an important economic crisis in South America. Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina suffered very heavily, and this made this integration movement in South America reshape in a way to what we call new developmentalism in the 2000s. So basically, those were left-leaning governments that would rise in the region, and they would re-signify what integration would be in the region. Very quickly, here's a map of Mercosur with member states in dark blue. Here, UNASUR was a more general institution comprising the Andean community with the Andean countries and Mercosur. This is 2010, it's largely been disbanded right now. And so we have these ups and downs of integration of Uruguayan regionalism in the 21st century. So first of all, in 2008, we have UNASUR, this map that we just showed here. Yeah, it was founded in 2008 as a large integration project in South America. Starting in 2018, however, you do have this crisis of South American integration, and Uruguay leaves UNASUR in 2020. Many countries had left already, yeah, and this has to do with the fall of, largely to the fall of those left-leaning countries in the region. And then we had the beginning of the Forum for the Progress and Development of South America, which is more of a non-organization but a liberal congregation of countries. And now we have the ongoing crisis of South American integration and third-party allure. So Uruguay and China, they have been talking a lot and having lots of negotiations concerning free trade, which has been adding to the insecurities of integration in the continent. And this is always the question here, and I'll just hand over to Diego now. So, does integration in South America reflect more power to those countries, small countries, or some sort of imperialism from an Argentinian and Brazilian perspective, which is always something that Paraguay and Uruguay have historically doubted as to the intentions of those two countries. Petros, he mentions that, and he calls that strategic regionalism for Uruguay, which is also an interesting work if you want to learn more about Uruguay's intention in regionalism. And this is how UNASUR is today. So largely the only countries that are left are Venezuela, some of the Guianas, and Bolivia. All the other countries have disbanded.
Thank you, Flávio. Well, sorry, my English is not so beautiful as Flávio. I would like to pass very quickly to Uruguay your behavior linked with multilateralism and international organizations. Uruguay have a long story about this. Uruguay take part at the beginning of 20th century in the International Hague Conventions for International Arbitration. Then Uruguay was the first round of trade negotiation in the 80s was in Uruguay round, and Uruguay have a long history of participation in United Nations, fundator of United Nations, fundator of League of the National Society, and in both Uruguay have some behavior trying to protect other small countries, not only because Uruguay has some sympathy with these countries, what could be the case of Israel or Armenia, but also because Uruguay understands that it's important to ensure that these organizations protect small countries. In this sense, for example, Uruguay was on the National Society, Uruguay was one of the countries who support Armenian integration for National Society in the 20s. Uruguay was the first country in the world who recognized Armenian genocide in 1965. And more recently, Uruguay is in the country related with population with more soldiers in peace operation of United Nations. And in some issues we can think Uruguay like a normal entrepreneur in international arena, for example, the recognition of Armenian genocide, and more actual issues also, we can think something like this. And it makes, I think it is interesting to discuss how Uruguay, in the one hand, is protected. Uruguay has the advantage, like all Latin American countries, that is protected by the only major power in the region, United States, and it avoids situations of conflicts, like, for example, Caucasus or Central Asia, small countries are always threatened. But on the other hand, Uruguay can discuss with these major powers when their behavior in international organizations it's against all small countries. This is the case of 1965, for example, the United States invasion for... Sounds cool? Okay. United States... I'm almost finished, sorry. United States invasion for Dominican Republic. Also in 65, you can imagine Uruguay recognition of Armenian genocide in a moment when Turkey was a strong ally from the United States. It was some way of have some difference with United States major power in our hemisphere. And in 2016, in our last participation in United Nations Security Council, also Uruguay have some difference with United States, France, and Western powers linked with situation in Sahrawi Republic, when Uruguay tried to protect Sahrawi Republic against the other continental powers, in this case Morocco. Just to finish in this minute, I think it's interesting two main conclusions. First, this one, shelter theory say that small countries get some protection in regional and international organizations, but it's interesting to discuss what happened with major powers who in theory led these organizations and respect the rules of these organizations, and how small countries can do alliance or different behaviors to protect itself of these major powers. And for finish, about returning to Flávio's speech, this situation when the regions have some problems, how small countries have more flexibility to try to find international opportunities in global arena, for example, free trade agreement with China. Sorry if I not so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We will be happy to listen to these presentations for a much longer time, but we have a time constraint. And I think that the shelter theory is very efficient in explaining many developments in today's world, so thank you very much for the interesting topic. Last but not least, let's turn to Professor Hilary Brieffa, who is a lecturer in National Security Studies at King's College London, and her presentation is entitled The Mediterranean Interlocutor, Malta's Grand Strategy. Professor Brieffa, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
And you can see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start the timer. So thank you very much for this conference. There have been some amazing talks, and it's a pleasure to be here even at the end. I hope you're still with us. Today I'll be speaking about Malta, the Mediterranean Interlocutor. And so I'll start by giving a bit of context about Malta for those who are not so familiar with this case study. So Malta is a typical small state. It has a population of just 500,000 people, all crammed into just 316 kilometers square of land. So this makes it one of the smallest, but also one of the most densely populated countries in the whole world. There are fewer than 2,000 active military personnel in the military, and as the smallest of the EU member states, Malta conforms to many of those structural, economic, and political limitations that are endemic to small states and that we've been discussing for these 2 days. We find a small domestic market, limited competition possibilities, limited human capital, poor natural resources, constraints upon the labor market, and those insularity and remoteness costs because it's an island as well. But Like several other particularly successful small states, such as Qatar and Singapore and Bahrain, Malta has found a way to build resilience to overcome vulnerabilities. So how does it do this? Well, as Major Karaguesian argued yesterday, small states try to do two things. First, they try to maintain their autonomy, and they try to increase their influence. So let's start with autonomy. And to understand this, we need to understand the strategic culture of Malta. And I've done this by putting this picture so that you can see that Malta is situated right at the heart of the Mediterranean. What does this mean? It means that historically every major military and economic power in the Mediterranean wanted to control this spot. So we had the Phoenicians, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Byzantines, the Arabs, the Normans, the Swabians, the Angevins, and the Aragonese, who all took their turn to occupy Malta. And so from a security perspective, historian Dominic Fenech writes that until 1530, Malta was indefensible. It could be taken by any regional power with the strength to do so. Then the history of Malta was marked by the hegemony of the Order of the Knights of St. John, who came to Malta in 1530 and ruled for 268 years, before they were kicked out by the French in 1798, and then in 1800, the British kicked out the French. And so it was only after a very long and turbulent campaign for sovereign independence that Malta finally became independent from Britain on 21st September 1964. So now that Malta was independent, how would it ensure that it would survive as one of the smallest sovereign actors in the international system? Well, in March 1979, Malta put into the constitution that Malta would be a neutral state, actively pursuing peace, security, and social progress among all nations by adhering to a policy of non-alignment and refusing to participate in military alliances. So the Maltese felt that a policy of neutrality would be the best way to ensure that they wouldn't get caught up in military expeditions that might lead them to be falling under a foreign occupier once again. And so this is how Malta secures her autonomy. What about influence? Well, there are two theories which I think explain the Maltese approach and which allow them to leverage that neutrality: status seeking and the smart state strategy. So looking at status first, you're probably all familiar by now with the philosopher Hobbes, who wrote in Leviathan that in the nature of man, we have three causes of quarrel. First, competition. Second, diffidence. And third, glory. The first makes me invade for gain, so think economic benefits. The second for safety, so think security. And the third for reputation. And it's this third one that we rarely talk about when we're thinking about power in international relations, and which has had very limited attention over these 2 days, apart from Mare's very great talk we just heard, but which is so important for small states that might not have access to the first two. So if we expand from Hobbes to Durkheim, he says that as long as there are states, so there will be national pride, and nothing can be more warranted. But societies can have pride not in being the greatest or the wealthiest, but being the most just, the best organized, and possessing the best moral constitution. So where for a great power status is about being a state to be reckoned with, Newman and Carvalho argue that for small states, it's often through ideas and morals, and about being noticed and seen. So, one way to gain this status and being noticed and seen is through what we call the smart state strategy for small states. Now, we know that today small states can only make a limited military contribution most of the times, but many of the problems we face today don't require a big military response, like combating pollution or illegal immigration. So small states can use and leverage their unique capabilities to offer knowledge, skills, and expertise in a niche that makes them useful and seen by others. So with my remaining time, the smart state strategy I'm going to focus on is that of being an honest broker. And this means a state that brokers compromise and mediates among other states. And Jack Corbett, who's a professor at Southampton University, calls this the competent performance of vulnerability. Small states say, look at us, we're weak. We're not trying to serve our own interests, we just want everybody to be friends. And because they position themselves as being weak and not self-interested, they're perfectly positioned to play that role of brokering international peace, which is normally the responsibility of much bigger actors. And Norway's Oslo Accords are the perfect example of this. So let's bring this back to Malta. If you visit Valletta, the capital city, and go into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as soon as you come up the stairs, you come face to face with this statue that I've put a picture of. This is called the Chippy of Melkart, which is the collective name for two Phoenician marble chippy that were found in Malta and that date back to the 2nd century BC. Why are they so special? Well, they are inscribed in two languages, ancient Greek and Phoenician. And so they can be thought of like the Rosetta Stone, allowing us to understand at last the Phoenician language. And this is why I've named my talk the Interlocutor, and I put the definition of interlocution here. Coming from Latin, it means a speaking between. So just like the Chippies speak between ancient Greek and the Phoenician language, we can take it as a metaphor for Malta's grand strategy to speak between Europe and other parts of the world. And I put some quotes here from across the political divide that show this. In 2011, Malta is a voice of the Arab world in the European Union. 2015, Malta has the vocation to serve as a bridge between Europe and the southern shores of the Mediterranean. Just 2 years ago, last year in 2020, current Foreign Minister Everest Bartolo, who said about the Libya crisis that Malta is in nobody's supporters club. We're not taking any sides. We talk to everyone. And so through this strategy, the country manages to seek status, build its reputation by linking geopolitics with its own culture and identity, and positioning itself as this useful, responsible peacekeeper, which is pretty inexpensive for a small state without a lot of resources. And to an extent, it's been quite successful. During the Arab Spring in 2010, Malta became the hub for all humanitarian agency operations in the consequent missions to Libya. The 2011 Libya crisis actually typified the utility of Malta for multilateral security. While other countries could send in the military, neutral Malta could support with emergency landings, water, food, airspace, taking out refugees, and support leading the humanitarian effort, which is an equally important duty. And so this can be summed up by saying that while Malta was neutral, she was not neutralized. At the same time, with my last 2 minutes, I need to also show that if Malta's smart state strategy and success of serving as an interlocutor depends on being an honest broker, right? It's all about trust. Then what happens if you lose that trust? And I'll tell you the other side of the story with my remaining minute. So in 2017, Malta assumed the presidency of the Council of the EU for the first time, and throughout that period, the government were plagued by accusations of corruption from investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. 4 months after the council presidency, the journalist was assassinated by a car bomb, and these are her last written words. There are crooks everywhere you look now. The situation is desperate. This led to an outcry across the EU and raised questions about Malta's democratic standards. In 2017, the EU led a mission to Malta, and they reported that the culture of impunity in Malta fosters corruption, organized crime, and state capture. And this created the conditions for the murder of the journalist. In particular, they picked up on the problem of Malta's golden passport scheme, where if you spend enough money, you can buy a Maltese passport and get visa-free access and free movement across 27 EU countries and access to banks, courts, and financial sectors, essentially aiding money launderers. And so to conclude, this is why Gomez says what's happening in Malta concerns us all. We're discussing money laundering, corruption, and even our own security. And so the actions of the smallest member state are affecting the security of the region. And so in the past, where we might write about Malta and write about these churches and beaches and beautiful temples, the headlines are now talking about something much, much darker. And so Malta's strategy of serving as an honest broker is collapsing. In November 2019, this was further compounded when evidence surfaced linking the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff to the murder of the journalist. And even though he resigned, the Prime Minister resigned, the damage has been done. And so this is my last slide to say that if investors are unwilling to partner with the small state, this can compromise long-term autonomy. If Malta's smart state strategy has lost legitimacy because it's not being seen as an honest broker, then there's a loss of long-term influence. And so to paraphrase Foreign Minister Bartolo, instead of being in nobody's supporters club, without fixing its reputation, Malta quickly risks finding herself with no supporters. Thank you, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Brieffa, and a special thanks for your enthusiasm. I think it was very nice to be energized by your lecture. So now we turn to the Q&A session. I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to abuse my powers as the moderator, so I turn to the audience whether we have any questions. I see one hand. I'm checking the online participants, and we have another hand online. So first, I'm turning to my colleague, Bill.
Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I have two questions. One is for our colleague from King's College. Excellent presentation. I was wondering about Malta's approach to irregular migration, which seems to be a little bit different compared to what we've seen from small states in regions of concern. So usually there is a great deal of worry and concern for large numbers of irregular migrants. I'm not so sure Malta took the same approach. It didn't seem to militarize irregular migration. I'm just wondering what is the thinking behind their softer approach? The second question is for our Cypriot colleagues. Fascinating presentation. I'm just wondering about the Cypriot grant strategy and whether now that the systemic pressures in the Eastern Mediterranean are a bit more tense, Cyprus is transitioning from an interlocutor, a mediator, to a type of an outpost state. So we've seen Cypriot leaders oftentimes portray the island as a beacon of liberal democracy in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's not really mediating between two worlds, but actually acting as an outpost, as the border of one. I'd love to hear your comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We are going to have 10 minutes for the Q&A. In order to have a second round, I would like to ask Professor Strauss as well to share his question, and then I will let the participants answer.
There we go. Yes, thank you for some excellent presentations. It's always nice to have a conference workshop end with a strong panel. I have two questions. One is to Professor Ushkovska, and that is, you were talking about the use of the diaspora during the latest conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. What I'm wondering is if there have been any cases that you know of states, small states, involved in conflict using branding to promote their position with their own public, with foreign publics, in order to build political support for their side of in the conflict, as opposed to simply using branding for positive things like tourism, investments, and stuff like that. And then the second question is for Professor Brieffa, and I'm wondering you mentioned that the neutrality of Malta is built into the Constitution. How does this jibe with any potential EU defense force? Because I'm here in France, and the president of France is really pushing for that. Is it possible to maintain neutrality if you're part of an intergovernmental or international organization that itself becomes not so neutral in a conflict? Okay, I'll shut up and leave it to the...
Thank you very much for the excellent questions. So Professor Brieffa received 2 questions, Professor Ushkovska received 1, and the first duo received 1 question as well. Let's do the answering in a reverse order. Professor Brieffa, can I give the floor to you?
Yes, that's good, because if I'm allowed at the end, I would like to ask my panelists a question, so I will take the opportunity while I have the microphone. So I'll go. So the first question was about Malta's approach to irregular migration, which it's nice to hear the audience members say that it's a softer approach than is seen in other countries, because that's not the perception that I really get from this case. Actually, it's a very controversial topic. It's the greatest security issue for a small island. You'll remember I said it's 500,000 people on just 316 kilometers square, which makes Malta the 10th most densely populated country in the world. And it's on the front lines of the immigration waves that especially come from Northern Africa. And so Malta used to have a reputation that stems from the First World War of being the nurse of the Mediterranean, when they used to provide shelter to wounded troops from the First World War. And this was used as part of what Mare called nation branding as well, to call this a place where refugees could seek haven and be welcomed. But over time, there has definitely been a shift in that perception towards migrants, especially after the peak of the migration crisis in 2015. I won't say the start, because even though in Europe they say the 2015 migration crisis for Malta, this has been a problem for much longer. And so Malta has actually taken more of a hardline stance that has been very controversial. In 2018, they pushed back boats to Libya, which is not considered a safe port for refugees. They refused to take them in. During the COVID pandemic, just last year, when refugees arrived and there were rumors there were outbreaks of COVID on board, they were kept on boats on the water for days on end, for weeks on end, just they wouldn't allow them to dock on the shore. And it's been increasingly calling into question Malta's commitment to human rights. And so the way to go about this, as you said, I know you said they don't take as much of a militaristic approach, although Malta's military is largely used for search and rescue, because it's not used, it's a neutral country, it doesn't use it for military expeditions, it uses them largely for search and rescue. Malta's approach as a small state is to try to use international organizations and to try to amend the Dublin II regulations, which are regulations in the EU that say where refugees should go and asylum seekers when they arrive in a country. At the moment, if they arrive in your territorial waters, they go to your country, and Malta's territorial waters are 350 times its size. So it's trying to do it through negotiation and through playing a role in the EU. Malta's the rapporteur on Frontex in the EU, and has just put through quite a lot of legislation. So not to go on, because I could give a whole sermon on this, I'll say they are trying to find ways that through diplomacy to try to change the regulations. It's not going as well as we hope, and it's what's leading to a lot of tensions and controversy, even within Malta, against the EU, which is seen as not supporting this migration crisis. I'll give a much shorter answer to Micah's question, which was about neutrality in the constitution. How does this jive with a potential EU defense force? Malta is the only country that has not signed up in the EU, has not signed up to PESCO, which is the evolution of the common security framework, precisely because it is neutral. Neutrality has a very strong resonance in the country. It's the only country that had actually pulled out of NATO's Partnership for Peace when there was disagreement by the Labour Party, who thought that this compromises Malta's neutrality, and it then joined again when it was back under a nationalist government, but this is unprecedented, and this is because Malta is always concerned with with not compromising this neutrality. But today, it's the exact question you asked, neutrality to what? In the Constitution, it says neutrality towards the superpowers, because it was written at the height of the Cold War. Today, how do we define that neutrality? And Malta is currently ongoing constitutional reform to try to see what the new constitution is going to look like, because it hasn't been updated since independence properly. And that is one of the debates the country is having. How can we keep this neutral posture in a way that still chimes with our relationship and our alliances within the EU? But that's why Malta is part of something like the EU and not NATO. And if I can ask a quick question to my panelists before I pass the floor to them so that they can answer it as well, maybe. I had a question to Mare, which is your talk had amazing examples of all the positive nation branding. I wonder if you know of any examples of a country with a bad reputation that's managed to turn it around, because that's what my concern is about Malta at the moment, that it's got this tattered reputation. Is it a lost cause, or are there countries that have turned it around? And to Petros, you gave the example, you had various examples of states joining security organizations. And I noticed at the end you had Finland, which is, a neutral country, but you said when it's under threat, it looks to join a security organization. And you said Finland is in the EU, not NATO. So do you see any pattern in why some countries under threat might go the route of instead of the neutral route, they go for the security organization, or vice versa? Because I'm seeing both examples and I just wonder if there's a pattern. Okay, thank you for listening. I pass over to whoever is next.
Thank you. Thank you very much for both the answers and the questions. Professor Ushkovska, can I give the floor to you?
I'll try and keep it brief. To the question from Mr. Strauss, I can give an example of where countries that have been in conflict have used a combination of diaspora assets and, country branding to promote their point of view. And I'll give the example of Kosovo. I don't know if you're familiar, but the famous pop singers from Britain, like Rita Ora and Dua Lipa, are actually either born in Kosovo or of Kosovar heritage. And because they are British, very globally famous, but also very keen to promote their heritage, Kosovo has been quite happy to associate itself with this pop star fame and positive aspects. So in a way, they're using the good image of their diaspora to change the image of the country, for Kosovo not to be related with a former conflict zone or a place of human trafficking, but to be associated as an exporter of great pop stars. They've even made, if I remember correctly, Rita Ora their honorary consul several years ago for this purpose. So that's the example I can come up with. To Hilary's question, it's a very good question, and I'm sure if I had more time to think about it, I would come up with great answers. It's just I cannot think of a good example on the spot. But we can be in touch and communicate over this. Over email, perhaps.
Yeah, we need you to rescue us.
Yes, as a Hungarian researcher, I'm also interested in that answer. Thank you very much. So now I would like to give the floor to Professor Petrikkos and Professor Papaioakeim.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to start off with Hilary's question regarding whether there's a pattern in why Finland appears to be joining certain organizations, but in a way avoiding others. Well, our theory stands out. First of all, I'd like to say that there's no universal pattern. We don't really believe that in our research a universal pattern will emerge per se. We do believe that indirectly certain conditions are shaped within each and every small state that is under threat, which is why our hypothesis is that they will behave differently. They will prioritize other interests over certain aspects that other small states have in terms of in their consideration when it comes to joining international organizations, when it comes to joining security organizations as well. For example, we are looking at how Slovenia initially decided to join certain security organizations as a means of promoting their political influence instead of mainly resorting to upholding and upgrading its own security and defense capabilities. Finland, however, is actually interesting in the sense that in the case of promoting relations, further enhanced relations with the EU bloc, they do see themselves as capable of addressing certain security concerns within the bloc, but on the other hand, they will not join organizations such as NATO in anticipation of a potential threat coming from Russia, which is to their understanding an existential threat. And before I hand over to Marinos to give a bit of a detailed answer, I want to go to, I think that was Dr. Gabis, if I'm not mistaken, who asked the question on Cypriot grand strategy from the audience. So yes, I would say that in terms of strategy, it does appear in real terms, and this is what we've discussed, how what small states attempt to portray, what they're actually trying to picture themselves within the rest of the international political scene, is that they want to emphasize obviously the positive aspects of collaborating with them within international institutions. So Cyprus, in the case of the Republic of Cyprus, they want to appear as an interlocutor, as a reliable partner, as a mediator in the Middle East, but realities on the ground are very different. We have conducted some interviews as well with high-level officials who have indeed confirmed that this is what the Republic of Cyprus is trying to do. They want to appear as a reliable partner. Now, instead of that, and in reality, if they actually appear as an outpost, which is a very interesting question, yes, there's a different understanding of what was happening on the ground. I will pass on to Marinos to give more, to respond in greater detail, if that's okay.
Thank you, Petros. Thank you for your comments and questions. First of all, replying to Hilary's question, I mean, you're right. Let's say that Finland is an exception to the whole area of Baltics. Since it's the only country that did not join to NATO. At the same time, at the time that you're asking the question, I open again the maps and I see the huge border that they share, Finland and Russia. So I think that this is a part of my answer that, as Petros said, Finland, since they share this huge border, in that way they don't want to challenge Russia in any way, since, as Petros said, it's perceived as an existential threat by Finland. Now, in terms of the first question about the Cypriot grand strategy, I will of course agree with Petros, and of course I will agree with your comment. This is a part of the paradox that we were talking at the beginning of our presentation. On the one hand, you don't want to be part of the problem. You don't want to be part of the tension in the area. But at the same time, you want to provide and promote yourself and brand yourself, as Mare said, and using branding strategies. So you want to promote yourself as a mediator in the area, as a pillar of stability. This is one of the common phrases that is used by the government the last 15 years for Cyprus, that Cyprus is a pillar of stability. So, according to our understanding, this is part of the game. It's part of the international image that Cyprus wants to promote. On the one hand, as a pillar of stability for some countries or for some institutions and organizations, such as the EU. But on the other hand, the Cypriot government wants to secure its interest in the wider area of the Eastern Mediterranean. I hope that answers your question, and thank you again.
Thank you very much for all your answers and questions. I wish that all conferences would end with such a lively discussion. Now we are going to have a short 10 minutes break, and then we will proceed with the concluding the ceremony. But before we do that, join me in giving a round of applause to our great speakers in this panel. Thank you very much.